I still remember the exact second my hands started shaking, because it wasn't when I unlocked my son's phone, and it wasn't even when I realized I was snooping. It was when I read the words clear as day, burned into my memory like a scar. I'm putting the old woman in a nursing home. The house will finally be ours. My heart dropped so hard it felt like my chest cracked open. I stood there in my own kitchen, the one I had cooked in for decades, staring at a screen that told me my own son had already decided I was disposable. I want you to tell me honestly, before you judge anything I did after that, was I wrong for protecting myself, or would you have done the same if you realized your own child was planning to erase you from your own life? I'm a woman in my early 60s, a widow, and until that moment, I truly believed I had raised a good man. My son, Daniel, was my only child. I had him later in life, after years of thinking motherhood just wasn't in the cards for me. When his father died suddenly from a heart attack, Daniel was only 17, and from that day on, it was just the two of us against the world. I worked double shifts, skipped vacations, wore the same coats for years. Also, he could go to college without drowning in debt. The house we lived in wasn't fancy, but it was mine, paid off inch by inch, mortgage by mortgage, through decades of sacrifice. Every wall held memories, every creak in the floorboards was familiar. That house was never just property to me. It was proof of survival. When Daniel married his wife, Melissa, things started changing in ways I didn't immediately recognize as dangerous. At first, she seemed polite enough, a little cold maybe, but I told myself I was being overly sensitive. She was younger, ambitious, very focused on appearances. She always had opinions about how things should be done, what was modern, what was practical. I tried hard to be the kind of mother-in-law people praise. I gave them space. I didn't interfere. When they struggled financially early in their marriage, I let them move into my home so they could save money. I didn't charge rent. I told them this was their home too, because family helps family. I meant it. But slowly, without me realizing it, the language shifted. It went from your house to the house, from your rules to what makes sense for everyone. Melissa started rearranging furniture without asking. She replaced my curtains because they were dated. She once laughed and said, "This place will look amazing once we renovate it." I remember smiling tightly, not wanting to start conflict, even though something in my stomach twisted. Daniel would brush it off whenever I tried to talk to him. He'd say I was overthinking things, that Melissa was just trying to help. I wanted to believe him, so I did. As the years passed, I noticed I was becoming invisible in my own home. Decisions were made without me. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. If I expressed discomfort, I was told I was being emotional, dramatic, or paranoid. Melissa had a way of smiling while making you feel small, like you were an inconvenience she was tolerating out of obligation. Daniel, my sweet boy, who once hugged me every morning before school, started avoiding eye contact when I brought up anything serious. I told myself this was just what happens when children grow up. Mothers get left behind. That's life, right? Then came the comments about my age, subtle at first, jokes about me forgetting things, suggestions that I should slow down. Melissa would casually mention nursing homes she'd seen online, always framed as concern. They have activities, she'd say. Medical staff, you wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning. Every time she said it, I laughed it off, but inside, fear crept in. I was healthy. I paid my own bills. I drove, I cooked. I cleaned. I didn't need care. I needed respect. The day I saw the message, Daniel had left his phone on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to spy. I swear that. It lit up with a notification while I was wiping the counter, and I saw Melissa's name. I know I shouldn't have looked, I know that, but something told me to. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was years of quiet dismissal finally screaming to be heard. I unlocked it because I knew his passcode. I'd known it since he was a teenager, and he'd never changed it. That alone should tell you how little he thought I'd ever cross that line. What I read felt like betrayal layered on top of betrayal. Messages back and forth, not just about me, but about timelines, about money, about how much the house was worth. Melissa called me the old woman repeatedly. Daniel didn't correct her once. In fact, he agreed. He said I was too attached, and that putting me in a nursing home would be for the best. He said, once the house was legally theirs, they could finally start the life they wanted. I felt something break inside me that I don't think will ever fully heal. I put the phone back exactly where it was and went to my bedroom. I locked the door and sat on my bed, staring at the wall, replaying every moment of the last few years, trying to see where I went wrong. I cried silently because I didn't want them to hear me. I cried for my husband, for the boy I raised, for the woman I had become in my own home, afraid and unwanted. And then, beneath the grief, something else rose up, resolve. I realized that if I didn't act, I would lose everything. Not just my house, but my dignity. I didn't confront them right away. I needed time. I needed clarity. I started paying attention, really paying attention. I noticed how Melissa controlled conversations, how she answered questions for Daniel, how she always redirected topics when I mentioned the future. I noticed documents going missing from my filing cabinet, reappearing later in slightly different order. I noticed how often they talked in hushed tones. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. At night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining myself in some sterile room, surrounded by strangers, while my son slept in my bed, walked my floors, lived off my sacrifices. People love to say, your children won't do that to you. Let me tell you something, sometimes they will, especially when someone else is whispering in their ear that you are a problem to be solved. I decided to quietly consult a lawyer. I didn't tell anyone. I made the appointment under the excuse of a routine errand. Sitting in that office, explaining my situation, felt humiliating, like admitting failure as a mother. But the lawyer listened carefully. He asked questions. He confirmed something I already knew but needed to hear from someone else. The house was legally mine. Fully, no joint ownership, no loopholes. And unless I signed it away or was declared incompetent, no one could force me out. Walking out of that office, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I still had control. Sadness that I needed legal protection from my own child. That night, I lay awake again, but this time my thoughts were sharper. If they were planning behind my back, I needed to be steps ahead. This wasn't about revenge yet. This was about survival. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything. Comments, behaviors, dates, times. I took photos of important documents and stored them safely outside the house. I slowly removed sentimental items from shared spaces and placed them in storage, telling myself it was just decluttering. Melissa noticed, of course. She made remarks about me letting go, and I smiled, letting her think she was winning. But inside, I was preparing. Every morning, I looked at Daniel and tried to reconcile the man in front of me with the boy I raised. Sometimes I almost convinced myself the messages weren't real, that maybe he was just agreeing with Melissa to keep the peace. But then I remembered the words, the certainty, the plan, and I reminded myself that intentions matter, even if actions haven't happened yet. I don't know when exactly my fear turned into determination, but it did. I realized something very important. They thought I was weak. They thought age had made me pliable. They thought love meant obedience. They were wrong, so that's where things stood. I was living under the same roof as two people who saw me as an obstacle. I knew their plan. They didn't know I knew. And I had a choice to make. Before I tell you what I did next, I want you to think about it yourself. If you discovered your own child was planning to put you away and take your home, would you stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you protect yourself no matter how heartless it made you look? Because what I chose to do next changed everything, and in the next part, I'll tell you how I quietly started taking my power back, step by step, while they were still convinced I was just an old woman who didn't know what was coming. After that night, nothing felt the same, even though on the surface everything looked exactly as it always had. I still woke up early, made tea, watered the plants on the porch, and listened to the morning news like I'd done for years. Daniel and Melissa still came into the kitchen, scrolling on their phones, barely acknowledging me beyond a quick morning. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. I was no longer just living my life, I was observing it. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every casual comment felt like it might be hiding another knife. I started to understand something deeply uncomfortable. The woman they thought I was no longer existed. The trusting mother, the grateful older woman happy to be taken care of. That version of me had died the moment I read those words on Daniel's phone. In her place was someone quieter, sharper, and far more careful. I became very intentional about how I behaved. I stopped pushing back. If Melissa suggested something, I nodded. If Daniel talked over me, I let him. I let them think I was shrinking, retreating into myself. Melissa especially seemed pleased by this change. She started speaking more freely around me, assuming I wasn't really listening. She'd talk about finances, about how expensive houses were getting, about how lucky we were to already have one. She said "we" a lot. Every time she did, my stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. One evening, while we were having dinner, Melissa casually said, "I was looking at some really nice assisted living places today." She said it like she was talking about a new restaurant. Daniel barely looked up from his plate. He just hummed in agreement. I felt my hands go cold, but I forced a small laugh and said, "Oh, that's nice." Melissa smiled at me, satisfied, like a chess player watching a piece move exactly where she wanted. That night, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. How did we get here? How did the child I carried, raised, protected, become someone who could talk about discarding me like an old chair? I replayed his childhood in my mind, searching for signs I'd missed. Had I loved him too much? Not enough. Had I taught him sacrifice without teaching gratitude? The guilt gnawed at me, but then anger followed close behind. Because even if I'd made mistakes, did that justify what they were planning? I decided I needed allies. Quiet ones. I reached out to my sister, someone I hadn't talked to deeply in years because life just gets in the way. We met for coffee, and for the first time, I told someone everything. I told her about the messages, about the nursing home talk, about how invisible I felt. As I spoke, my voice shook, and tears slipped down my face despite my efforts to stay composed. My sister didn't interrupt. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, "You're not crazy, and you're not wrong to protect yourself." Those words mattered more than she probably realized. Validation is powerful when you've been gaslit for years. She encouraged me to keep everything documented and reminded me that love doesn't mean surrender. When I left that cafe, I felt a little less alone. Back at home, the tension grew in subtle ways. Melissa became more impatient with me. She corrected me constantly, even over small things, like how I loaded the dishwasher or folded towels. Daniel stayed neutral, which somehow hurt more than if he'd openly taken her side. His silence felt like permission. I noticed Melissa had started bringing up my health more often, always in front of others. When friends visited, she'd say things like, "Oh, she forgets things sometimes," or "she gets confused easily." I'd laugh it off, but inside, alarms were blaring. I realized she was building a narrative, one where I wasn't capable. One where moving me out wasn't cruel, but necessary. That realization scared me more than anything else so far. Because once someone convinces others you can't take care of yourself, things can move very fast. I started going to my doctor regularly, making sure everything was documented. Clean bills of health, mental clarity, independence. I kept copies of everything. It felt strange, preparing for a battle I never wanted to fight. But I'd learned the hard way that denial wouldn't protect me. At the same time, I began subtly reasserting my presence, not aggressively, strategically. I started inviting old friends over, people who knew me well and could clearly see I was perfectly fine. I reconnected with neighbors, chatting more, being visible. I wanted witnesses. I wanted community. Melissa didn't like that. I could see it in her tight smiles and the way she'd suddenly remember errands whenever people came by. Daniel started acting distant in a new way, almost guilty. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. Once, late at night, he knocked on my door. My heart raced as I opened it. For a moment, I thought maybe he was going to confess, apologize, but instead, he awkwardly asked if I'd thought any more about future plans, about how it might be nice not to have to worry about things. I looked at him and saw a man torn between comfort and conscience. I told him calmly that I was happy where I was and fully capable of deciding my own future. He nodded, but his eyes slid away. That was when I knew, deep down, that he had already chosen the easier path. I began making changes they didn't notice at first. I updated my will. I reviewed beneficiaries. I set things up so nothing could be quietly altered. I also started spending more time outside the house, reclaiming pieces of myself that had been slowly erased. I joined a local community group. I took a class. I reminded myself that I was more than just someone's mother or someone's inconvenience. Melissa grew bolder. One afternoon, she cornered me in the kitchen and said, "You know we worry about you, right?" Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were calculating. She talked about safety, about loneliness, about how these things happen to everyone eventually. I looked at her and realized something chilling. She genuinely believed she was entitled to my life, my space, my assets. In her mind, this wasn't theft. It was inheritance accelerated. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me, and finally admitted the truth to myself. This wasn't just misunderstanding or poor communication. This was a plan, and plans require responses. I started thinking ahead, imagining scenarios. What if they tried to pressure me into signing something? What if they brought in doctors or social workers? What if one day I came home and found my room cleared out? The fear was suffocating, but it also sharpened my focus. I told myself I would not be caught off guard again. And yet, despite all this preparation, a part of me still hoped it wouldn't come to that. I still loved my son. I still remembered the little boy who held my hand crossing the street, who cried when I worked late, who once told me I was his best friend. That love didn't disappear just because he'd hurt me. It complicated everything. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. One evening, I overheard Daniel and Melissa talking in their bedroom. They didn't know I was standing in the hallway. I heard Melissa say, "She's getting more stubborn. We need to speed this up." Daniel sighed and said, "I know, but we have to be careful." Careful? Not compassionate, not honest, careful. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat down. My hands were steady this time. My mind was clear. Whatever happened next would not be an accident. It would be a decision. So here I was, fully aware that the people living under my roof were actively planning to remove me from my own life. I had evidence, I had documentation, I had legal standing. What I didn't have was certainty about how far they were willing to go. Before I tell you what happened next, before I explain the move that finally forced everything into the open, I need you to really think about this. If you were a woman who gave everything to her child, and you discovered that same child was quietly arranging your exit for his convenience, would you confront them directly and risk everything blowing up, or would you make a move so decisive that they could never hurt you again? Because in the next part, I'm going to tell you about the choice I made, the one that shocked them, divided our family, and set off a chain of events none of us could take back. By the time I reached the point where I knew I had to act, I was living in a strange state of calm, mixed with constant tension, like the quiet right before a storm breaks. Every sound in the house felt louder. Every conversation felt loaded with meaning. I knew they were planning something, and they knew I was no longer as pliable as they wanted me to be. It was a dangerous standoff, even if no one was saying it out loud. I started noticing small but telling changes. Melissa became more organized, almost aggressively so. She was sorting papers, labeling folders, making phone calls she'd end the moment I walked into the room. Daniel started asking questions that felt rehearsed, like whether I'd considered downsizing or how much money I had saved. The way he asked wasn't curious, it was strategic. It hurt more than I can explain, realizing my own son was gathering information about me like I was a case file. One afternoon, Melissa sat me down at the dining table, the same table where I'd helped Daniel with homework for years. She put on that calm, sympathetic voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. She talked about how stressful life had been lately, how hard it was juggling work, marriage, and worrying about me. She said she thought it might be best if we started looking at options. I asked her what options she meant, even though I already knew. She smiled and said, "Just in case." That phrase echoed in my head long after the conversation ended. Just in case of what? My death? My collapse? Or just in case they got tired of waiting? I nodded through most of it, asking neutral questions, letting her think she was getting through to me. Inside, I was cataloging every word, every implication. When Daniel joined us and backed her up, I felt something inside me finally harden completely. That was the moment hope died. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a candle going out. I understood then that there would be no sudden realization on his part, no tearful apology. If I wanted to survive this with my dignity intact, I would have to stop waiting for him to become the son I remembered. I began making my move slowly, carefully, because I knew if I acted too fast, they'd push back harder. I started by asserting my independence in small ways. I handled my own appointments. I paid my bills loudly, making sure receipts were visible. I talked openly about my plans for the future, vacations I wanted to take, things I wanted to do with the house. Melissa's smile tightened every time I mentioned my house, but she said nothing. At the same time, I quietly strengthened my support system. My sister checked in on me regularly. A neighbor I trusted knew the basics of what was going on. I even spoke to a financial advisor, making sure everything was airtight. It felt surreal, like I was preparing for a divorce instead of protecting myself from my own family. Then something happened that made it clear I was running out of time. One morning, Melissa mentioned a meeting she'd scheduled with a care coordinator. She said it casually, like it was no big deal. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out, but I kept my voice steady and asked what it was about. She said, "Just information, no pressure." Daniel stood there silently, avoiding my eyes. That silence told me everything. That night, I sat alone in my room and realized this was the crossroads. If I waited any longer, they'd start bringing in outsiders, professionals, paperwork. Once that started, things could spiral out of my control quickly. I knew I had to make a decisive move, something that would force the truth into the open and put me back in charge. Before I tell you exactly what I did, I want you to pause here and really put yourself in my place. Imagine being a woman who built her life brick by brick, only to realize the people closest to her see her as an obstacle. Imagine knowing that if you hesitate, you could lose your home, your independence, your identity. So tell me honestly, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have tried one last conversation, hoping love would win out? Or would you have chosen self-preservation, even if it meant becoming the villain in their story? Because what I did next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make revenge look. But it was final. I went back to my lawyer. This time, I didn't just ask questions. I made decisions. I explored every legal option available to me, every way to protect myself and my property. The more I learned, the clearer it became that I still had power, far more than Daniel and Melissa realized. They were counting on my fear and hesitation. They were counting on me being nice. They underestimated how dangerous a woman can be when she's backed into a corner. I also started preparing emotionally, because I knew whatever came next would shatter the illusion of family we'd been clinging to. I mourned in advance. I cried for the relationship I wished I still had with my son. I cried for the future I thought we'd share. But beneath the grief, something else grew, a fierce determination not to disappear quietly. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Melissa's patience wore thin. She made sharper comments, less disguised. Daniel grew more distant, spending less time at home. It felt like they were bracing themselves for a confrontation, even if they didn't know when it would come. And then, one evening, Melissa crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She said in front of Daniel, "We can't keep living like this. Something has to change." She looked straight at me when she said it. The message was clear. Either I went quietly, or things would get ugly. I smiled at her, a calm, measured smile that surprised even me. I said, "You're right. Something does have to change." The relief on her face was immediate, and for a brief second, I almost felt sorry for her, because she had no idea what I meant. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the house settle, I knew the next day would alter everything. There was no going back. Whatever happened, I would never again be the woman who stayed silent to keep the peace. In the next part, I'm going to tell you about the moment everything came out into the open, the confrontation that revealed who everyone really was, and the decision that ultimately led me to take back what was mine, no matter how heartless it made me seem. The morning everything finally exploded started like any other, which somehow made it worse. I woke up before sunrise, made my tea, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky slowly change color. I remember thinking how strange it was that such an ordinary morning could carry so much weight. I already knew what I was going to do that day. I'd known it the night before, lying in bed, staring into the dark. Once the decision settled in my chest, it felt heavy but also strangely relieving, like finally setting down a burden I'd been carrying for years. Daniel and Melissa came into the kitchen together, talking quietly. When they saw me, they both stopped. Melissa recovered first, smiling too brightly, and asked if I'd slept well. I nodded and told her I had. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. Inside, my heart was racing, but on the outside, I was calm in a way I'd never felt before. Calm because I knew something they didn't. Calm because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting to their plans. I was executing mine. I told them I needed to talk to both of them later that afternoon, that it was important. Melissa's eyes flicked to Daniel, and I could almost hear the thoughts racing through her head. This was it, she probably thought. The surrender. Daniel looked nervous, but he agreed. I left the house shortly after, telling them I had errands to run. That part wasn't a lie. I went straight to my lawyer's office. We'd already prepared everything, but that morning we finalized it. Papers were signed, instructions were confirmed, every what-if was addressed. Sitting there, pen in hand, I felt a wave of emotion crash over me. Sadness, anger, grief, but also pride. I was choosing myself. After decades of putting everyone else first, I was choosing myself. When I walked out of that office, I felt lighter, even though I knew the fallout would be brutal. On my way home, I stopped by the bank and then by a storage facility. Small, practical steps, but each one felt symbolic, like closing doors behind me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were steady. I was ready. That afternoon, I asked Daniel and Melissa to sit down with me in the living room. We sat facing each other, the three of us, like strangers negotiating a deal instead of family. I took a deep breath and told them I knew everything. I told them about the messages on Daniel's phone. I told them I knew about the nursing home plans, the timelines, the conversations they thought I couldn't hear. The color drained from Daniel's face. Melissa didn't even bother pretending. Her jaw tightened and her eyes hardened. Daniel tried to speak, stumbling over his words, saying it wasn't like that they were just talking. I cut him off, something I'd never done before, and told him I'd read his exact words. The room went silent. Melissa finally spoke, and her tone wasn't sweet anymore. She said they were only thinking about what was best for everyone, that I was being selfish for standing in the way of their future. Hearing her say it out loud was like being slapped, not because I hadn't expected it, but because it confirmed everything. I told them calmly that the house was mine, that legally it always had been, that no one could force me into a nursing home. Melissa scoffed and said, "We'll see about that." And that was the moment I knew she still thought she had leverage, that she still believed I was bluffing. That's when I told them the part that changed everything. I told them that, effective immediately, they needed to find somewhere else to live. The confusion on Daniel's face was almost painful to see. Melissa's mouth actually fell open. She asked me what I was talking about, as if she couldn't comprehend the words. I repeated myself. I told them they were no longer welcome in my home. Daniel stood up, his voice rising, asking how I could do this to him, to them. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and said, "You decided I was disposable. You planned my removal from my own life. This is the consequence of that choice." My voice broke at the end, but I didn't take it back. Melissa exploded. She accused me of manipulation, of cruelty, of ruining their marriage. She said I was punishing them for trying to help. Every word confirmed I'd done the right thing. She never apologized. She never showed remorse. She was angry because her plan had failed. Daniel begged. That hurt the most. He said he hadn't meant it, that he'd never actually go through with it, that Melissa had pressured him. I listened, tears streaming down my face, because part of me wanted to believe him. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger over the past months, knew that intentions don't erase actions. I told him I loved him, but I couldn't trust him anymore. And without trust, there was nothing left to build on. They left that evening, not quietly. There were slammed doors, shouted accusations, and bitter tears. I stood in the hallway, holding myself together, listening to the sounds of their departure. When the front door finally closed, the house fell silent in a way it hadn't been in years. I slid down the wall and cried harder than I ever had before. I cried for my son. I cried for the family I thought I had. I cried for the fact that doing the right thing can sometimes feel like the worst kind of loss. The days that followed were a blur. Word spread quickly, of course. Family members called, some supportive, some accusatory. Some told me I was brave. Others said I was heartless. Daniel didn't speak to me for weeks. When he finally did, it was distant, cautious, like we were strangers feeling our way through a conversation. Melissa, on the other hand, cut me off completely. I heard through others that she was furious, that she told anyone who would listen that I'd stolen their future. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath. I started to feel peace, real peace. The house felt like mine again. I rearranged furniture the way I liked. I put my old curtains back up. I played music out loud. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells in my own home. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt. It did. It still does. Losing your child, even emotionally, is a pain that doesn't have neat edges. But I also learned something powerful. Love doesn't require self-destruction. Being a mother doesn't mean accepting betrayal. And that brings me to where things stand now, and to the final part of this story, where I'll talk about what happened after the dust settled, whether my son and I ever found our way back to each other, and what I'd say to any woman who finds herself in the same terrifying position I was in. It's strange how life continues after something you think will break you completely. In the weeks after Daniel and Melissa left, I moved through my days like someone learning how to walk again. Everything felt quieter, slower, but also clearer. The house, my house, felt different without their presence. At first, the silence was deafening. I'd catch myself listening for their footsteps, their voices, even their arguments, and then I'd remember they were gone. Sometimes that realization brought relief. Other times, it brought a wave of grief so strong I had to sit down and breathe through it. I replayed the confrontation in my mind more times than I can count, wondering if I could have said something differently, if there was a version of that day where things didn't end the way they did. That's the trap, I think, especially for women like me who were raised to smooth things over, to take responsibility for everyone's feelings. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the messages on Daniel's phone. I remembered being called the old woman. I remembered how easily they talked about erasing me from my own life. Those memories grounded me in reality when nostalgia tried to rewrite the past. Daniel and I spoke occasionally after that, short, careful conversations that felt more like negotiations than family talks. He apologized eventually, but it was a fragile apology, one that came with explanations and justifications. He said he felt trapped, that he didn't know how to stand up to Melissa, that he never thought it would go this far. I listened because I'm still his mother, and I still love him. But love doesn't mean amnesia. I told him that forgiveness, if it came, would take time, and that trust would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. He accepted that, though I could tell he didn't fully understand it. Melissa never reached out. I didn't expect her to. In some ways, that made things easier. I stopped hearing about nursing homes. I stopped feeling like a burden in my own space. I reclaimed parts of myself that had been slowly shrinking for years. I painted the guest room the color I'd always wanted. I started hosting friends again, laughing loudly, living without apology. I even took a solo trip, something I'd never done before, and standing there on my own, I realized how capable I still was. People have asked me if I regret what I did. The answer isn't simple. I regret that it had to come to that. I regret that my son made choices that forced my hand. I regret that a relationship I cherished was damaged so deeply. But do I regret protecting myself? No, not for a second. Because the alternative would have been slowly disappearing, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of me but a room number and a visiting schedule. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that boundaries aren't acts of cruelty. They're acts of survival. And sometimes, the hardest boundaries to set are with the people who feel entitled to cross them, especially when you're a mother, especially when you're a woman who spent her life putting others first. I know some people will hear my story and say I was too harsh, that family should always come first, no matter what. To those people, I say this: family should never require you to sacrifice your dignity. Love should never come with a plan to remove you from your own life. And age should never be treated like a liability that makes you disposable. So that's my story. That's how I found out my own son was planning to put me in a nursing home, and how I chose to take back my home my autonomy, and my sense of self before it was too late. If you were in my position, would you have done the same, or would you have chosen differently? If you were on my side, please like this video. If you want to hear more real, raw stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments, because I read them, and because conversations like this matter. I'll see you all in the next story.